Fear is real, but when faced with death, fear is a whole different ballgame. This caver went down with thrill, but in the long run, the walls turned against him and the seconds became daring. As he could feel his own blood pump into his head, he could also feel his breath being pulled away. This is a story of a caver that caught the attention of many. The story begins with the Nutty Putty cave, a treacherous and infamous site west of Utah Lake, about 55 miles from Salt Lake City. This cave, known for its labyrinth-like design, was the setting of a horrifying tragedy in 2009. 26-year-old John Edward Jones, exploring the cave with family and friends, mistakenly ventured into an unmapped section. His luck ran out. He got stuck upside down in a narrow place. Despite a desperate rescue effort involving 137 volunteers over 27 hours, stick around to find out if he made it out alive. The Nutty Putty Cave is notorious for more than John's tragic fate. In 1999, two teenagers, both 17 years old, got wedged in a tight passage ominously called the birth canal. Rescuers needed 40 volunteers and nearly 12 hours to free them. In 2004, another heart-pumping case occurred when 16-year-old Brock Clark, trapped upside down in a tight section just past the corkscrew, had to wait 14 agonizing hours before he was saved. These events paint a chilling picture of the cave's danger, which has repeatedly tested the limits of human endurance. To understand the full horror of John's predicament, it helps to grasp the deadly design of the Nutty Putty Cave. It's a hypogenic cave, meaning it was carved out by superheated water rising from beneath the Earth's surface. This natural chaos is why adventurers loved it, but also why many became victims of its treachery. The Nutty Putty Cave extends approximately 1,400 feet underground, with its deepest point plunging 145 feet below the surface. From the entrance, explorers face two choices. Go right to areas like the Big Slide, Birth Canal, and Aorta Crawl, or head left to navigate the Maze, Big Room, and the Crack. Neither path guarantees safety. Warning signs littered the cave, highlighting the extreme challenges ahead in sections like the Birth Canal and Scout Eater. John's ordeal began when he slid into an unexplored shaft, unable to climb back out. Trapped upside down, his situation turned grim quickly. John's body endured unimaginable strain in his final hours. Being upside down for such an extended period placed immense pressure on his heart and lungs. Rescuers worked tirelessly, but the narrow passage left little room for tools or maneuvering. Each failed attempt brought mounting despair. The cave's name, Nutty Putty, adds a strange irony to its dark reputation. Coined by Dale Green, who discovered it in 1960, the name was inspired by Silly Putty, the toy that's both pliable and unpredictable. Green, the man who named the cave, originally thought the clay inside felt like a silly putty, but the name didn't sound right, so he called it Nutty Putty instead. The horrifying story of John Edward Jones begins here, deep within its treacherous tunnels. John entered the cave with his brother Josh and 9 others, including family and friends, during Thanksgiving in 2009. Both John and Josh were experienced cavers, though they hadn't explored caves together in years. The group split early on. Less experienced members went to easier sections while John and others sought tougher challenges. Within the first hour, John and Josh navigated a large area known as the Big Slide. John then suggested trying the Birth Canal, a notoriously tight and challenging section. Unfortunately, what they thought was the entrance to the Birth Canal turned out to be an unmapped part of the cave. John led the way, squeezing into a narrow passage. At first, he believed it would eventually open into a larger space where he could turn around. He pushed on, crawling through 15 feet of tight tunnel, then another 10 feet with jagged rocks jutting out. Eventually, he reached a section known as the Corkscrew. This part was notorious, requiring skill and a small body to navigate. John, however, was 6 feet tall and weighed 200 pounds, far from the ideal size for such a squeeze. He managed to force himself through, driven by the hope that the passage would open up. Beyond the Corkscrew, John found an incline. Other cavers had turned back at this point, knowing how dangerous it was. A 16-year-old boy had been stuck here in 2004 and barely escaped after 14 hours of rescue efforts. But John didn't stop. He climbed the incline, reached a sharp bend to the left, and faced a steep slope. Thinking he saw a wider opening ahead, he pushed onward. Then, everything went wrong. The space grew even narrower, but John kept going. Suddenly, he realized he was trapped. John pressed on a little more, hoping to find a way to turn around. Instead, he slid down into a hole only 18 inches by 10 inches wide. He became wedged upside down at a terrifying 70-degree angle. The opening he thought he saw was nothing but an illusion. Hours turned into a nightmare. For the first 5 hours, John's body was in a state of high adrenaline. His heart pounded, his blood pressure surged, and his muscles tensed as his body prepared for survival. Blood began pooling in John's head and chest, straining his heart and lungs. Rescue efforts began, involving over 100 volunteers. They worked tirelessly, attempting to free John from the deadly grip of the cave. However, the narrow passage made it nearly impossible to maneuver tools or equipment. Each attempt brought more despair as time slipped away. The Nutty Putty cave is infamous for these kinds of traps. Its passages are tight, winding, and unpredictable. The conditions inside are harsh, with sticky clay and slippery surfaces making every move dangerous. The air grows thin in deeper sections, adding to the danger. Adventurers like John entered seeking challenge and thrill, but for some, the cave became their tomb. John's story is one of bravery, desperation, and the unrelenting cruelty of nature. He fought hard, but the cave gave no mercy. As the hours passed, the toll on his body became unbearable. Rescue teams did everything they could, but the odds were against them. After 27 hours of being trapped, John's body gave out. Adrenaline surged through John's body when he got stuck, a natural response to danger. It pushed his cardiovascular system to its limits for a few minutes, giving him a sudden boost of strength. His heart raced, blood pressure spiked, and energy flooded his muscles. This rush might have helped him wiggle slightly from the crevice, but adrenaline is short-lived. After a few minutes, his body would have experienced a sharp drop in energy, leaving him weaker than before. John was already exhausted when he got trapped. Earlier, he and his brother Josh had spent about an hour navigating the big slide section of Nutty Putty Cave. The twisting, turning, crawling, and climbing had drained him. The 35-foot shaft he ventured into next demanded even more energy. By the time he reached the steep decline where he got stuck, his arms were likely burning from holding his weight. The decline added pressure on his body, and the tight space left him with little room to maneuver. When John hit the bottom of the shaft, the real nightmare began. One arm was pinned under his chest, and the other was trapped against a rock. He tried desperately to wedge himself free, using every ounce of strength he had left. Then, Josh crawled back into the shaft, feet first, and tried to pull John out. But the space was too tight, and John's body wouldn't budge. Both brothers ended up exhausted and frustrated, realizing they couldn't solve this alone. Hanging upside down in such a confined space put John's body under immense strain. The human body isn't designed to be inverted for more than a few seconds at a time. For John, the effects of being upside down began almost immediately. Every second added to his suffering. The crushing pressure on his chest made it hard to breathe. His vision may have blurred as blood built up behind his eyes. His heart would have been pumping furiously, trying to protect his brain from hemorrhaging while also battling the toxins building up in his blood. Doug Murdoch, a physician involved in the rescue effort, knew the situation was grim. He understood what John's body was enduring. Murdoch estimated that John had only a few hours before his body would give out completely. The psychological toll on John must have been just as severe. After Josh's failed attempt to free him, he crawled out of the cave to get help. The group had entered the cave at around 8 p.m., and by the time Josh made the distress call, it was roughly 9 p.m. Rescue teams quickly mobilized, but the situation was dire. Nutty Putty Cave's narrow passages made it nearly impossible to bring in tools or equipment. Rescuers faced an uphill battle, both physically and logistically. John's heart endured unimaginable stress during this time. After the initial adrenaline rush, his body shifted into survival mode. His heart pumped at an unnatural rate for hours, trying to counteract gravity's pull. This constant strain likely kept him in a state of hyperarousal, his body working overtime just to stay alive. As time passed, John's condition worsened. Blood pressure in his head increased, his heart rate slowed, and his organs began to fail. John had been trapped for almost 4 hours before she arrived. That's 4 hours of being wedged headfirst in a tight, dark crevice. Josh later described the sight as if John had been swallowed by the rock itself. Air was another critical issue. Being stuck in such a position, John's lungs would have struggled to work properly. Hours passed, and as his lungs weakened, they likely began filling with fluid. His brain would have been sending out relentless distress signals, amplifying his fear and anxiety. Science tells us that after 2 hours without food, the body begins craving more energy. For John, this hunger was worsened by the sheer physical exertion of crawling, squeezing, and pulling through the cave before he got stuck. Every movement had burned calories he couldn't replace. Stress compounded the problem. The human body releases cortisol in stressful situations, a hormone that triggers cravings for high sugar and high fat foods. This is the body's way of trying to maintain balance during a crisis. But for John, stuck in the cold rock with no food in sight, cortisol's effects were just another cruel reminder of his helplessness. The rescue crew outside had already started strategizing. They designed an intricate pulley system, hoping it could pull John free. One end of the pulley was attached to John's feet, while rescuers on the other end would use their combined strength to try and pull him out. Imagine the scene. Deep in the cave, surrounded by rock and darkness, John was trapped at a 7-degree angle, his body struggling to function. Outside, rescuers worked tirelessly, their hope clashing against the overwhelming odds. John's position wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deadly. Every second, his lungs fought harder for air, his blood turned more toxic, and his heart struggled to keep up. The rescue crew knew they were racing against time. They had to act quickly, but every attempt to free John came with risks. John's situation highlights the terror of being utterly helpless, in a place where the environment itself becomes the enemy. The rock, the darkness, the lack of air, they all worked together, tightening their grip on him. It was a battle against forces far beyond human control, and the stakes were life and death. The rescuers set up a pulley system in the narrow cave, determined to move John's 200-pound body even an inch. They anchored ropes and installed climbing cams in the shaft. But the task was overwhelming. The shaft was so tight, it only allowed one person at a time. Moving supplies or equipment in and out took nearly an hour for each trip. They tried using drilling equipment to free John, but the cramped space made it almost impossible. The smaller drills they could fit inside barely worked, and after 90 minutes of exhausting effort, they had only managed to chip away 6 inches of rock. The cave's ceiling was made of calcite, a material that refused to cooperate. Every time they anchored the pulley, it popped loose with even the slightest pull. Around 2:30 a.m., Susie left the cave, her attempts to free John unsuccessful. Ryan, another rescuer, crawled in to take her place. John wasn't alone during these changes, but the situation was getting worse. Ryan found John disoriented. When he asked John why he was stuck on his head, John responded with confusion, almost as if he believed someone else had put him there. That moment revealed just how badly John's condition had deteriorated. The lack of oxygen was taking its toll. His brain, starved of fresh air, was slipping into hypoxia, a condition where the brain cannot function properly due to insufficient oxygen. Ryan witnessed John swinging between calm conversations and sudden panicked thrashing. It was as if John was fighting a losing battle against his body's survival instincts. Medical experts would call this delirium. The rescue team gave him Gatorade through a straw, providing small bursts of energy and restoring his body's ionic balance. It wasn't much, but it helped. John spoke about Emily, his wife, their 1-year-old daughter Virginia, and the unborn child he hadn't yet met. At one point, He even spoke with Emily over a telecom. Hearing her voice must have been a flicker of light in the suffocating darkness, lifting his spirits just enough to keep him going. 9 hours had passed since John first became trapped, and the rescuers were no closer to freeing him. The pulley system was ready, but nothing about the situation had gotten easier. The cams on the calcite ceiling continued to fail under the strain, and John's position presented yet another challenge. His feet were pinned in such a way that they couldn't bend upward. The narrow cave wouldn't allow his legs to straighten, and the rescuers faced an unthinkable decision: breaking his knees to pull him out. Adding to the horror, John was in unbearable pain. His body had been hanging upside down for hours, blood pooling in his head and toxins building in his system. His organs were under immense pressure, his breathing shallow and labored. The rescuers worked tirelessly, but the cave seemed determined to hold on to John. The rock pressed down like an unyielding monster, and every attempt to free him only revealed more challenges. The narrow, claustrophobic tunnel, the unrelenting rock, and the weight of gravity turned the cave into a silent predator, and John was its prey. As the hours dragged on, the team clung to hope, but the grim reality loomed over them. Would the cave let him go, or would it claim him forever? The situation inside the cave had become dire. John's agony was evident when he told a rescuer that his legs were killing him. The rescuers pressed on, determined to free him despite the unbearable conditions. 8 men worked the pulley system while Ryan stayed close to monitor every movement. Slowly, John began to rise, inching upward until his feet touched the rock above the crevice. But then, he let out a scream. The pain was overwhelming. His red, tear-filled eyes showed how much he was suffering. After a short rest, they tried again. This time, disaster struck. As they pulled, the rope gave way. The cam at the top of the crevice snapped loose, and chaos followed. The pulley lashed back violently, striking Ryan in the face. He collapsed immediately, knocked unconscious with a broken jaw and swollen eyes. John, on the other hand, slid right back into the narrow crevice. He landed on his head, deeper than before. Despite everything, John did not seem visibly worse after the fall, but his body was far from okay. The strain had been building for hours. The prolonged stress, lack of oxygen, and upside-down position were taking their toll. His organs were shutting down, one by one. When Ryan was pulled out of the cave, his father, Dave, a cave expert, crawled in to check on John. For a moment, John seemed coherent enough to ask about Ryan's injuries. But then, he fell silent, unresponsive. Dave checked for a heartbeat and found one. It was faint, a flicker of life in a body overwhelmed by trauma. The fall had likely triggered an adrenaline surge, but John's heart was too weak to sustain him. Hanging upside down for so long had drained his strength. Blood couldn't circulate properly, and his heart struggled against the mounting strain. Low oxygen, crushing darkness, relentless panic, and total exhaustion compounded his suffering. Delirium had already clouded his mind. It was only a matter of time. Not long after, John's body shut down completely. Brandon, another rescuer, entered the cave to check on him, but there was no response. A paramedic followed to confirm what everyone feared. John had died. His heart had given out, unable to withstand the relentless pressure and stress. Cardiac arrest was the official cause of death. The tragedy left the rescue team and John's family devastated. In the wake of his death, the Nutty Putty cave was permanently sealed. The entrance to the crevice where John became trapped was blasted with dynamite, and concrete was poured over the main cave entrance to ensure no one could ever enter again. John's body was never recovered. He remains inside the cave, entombed where he spent his final hours. A memorial plaque now marks the entrance, a solemn tribute to John's life, and a stark reminder of the dangers of cave exploration. In his final moments, John seemed to accept his fate. He reportedly told Dave that he knew he wasn't coming out alive. The weight of those words lingers, a haunting echo of the fear and pain he endured. The Nutty Putty Cave, once a site of adventure and exploration, became a silent tomb, forever closed off from the world above. The events of that day remain a chilling testament to the unforgiving nature of the underground world. I won't be shocked if the Nutty Putty cave is opened one day in the future and explored, but I hope to God that when I'll report it, it will be of a good cause, not a grim outcome.